This is an Irreverent podcast. Check out irreverent.fm for shows from all our friends. Hello and welcome to Evangelical, a show exploring the world inside and outside the evangelical subculture. I'm your host, Blake Chastain. My guest this week is the wonderful Laura Polk. She's an anthropologist, writer, and an online pioneer in critiquing and making space for people who are deconstructing purity culture. Her site, No Shame Movement, began in 2013 with the intent to create a platform for people to discuss growing up in conservative Christian environments that were taught abstinence only and unlearning this ideology as adults. In this conversation, we talk about her life, purity culture, the intersection of race and religion, Bible man, and much more. Laura was absolutely fascinating to talk to. You can find info on how to follow her across the web in the show notes. She was also featured in a chapter of Linda K. Klein's recent book, Pure, Inside the Evangelical Movement That Shamed a Generation of Young Women and How I Broke Free, which is out and available for purchase now everywhere. But before we get into the interview, I want to talk a little bit about something really amazing that I was able to participate in this past weekend. This past weekend, I was able to travel down to Clearwater, Florida, to participate in an evangelical community roundtable with Chris Stroop, Catherine Brightbill, Akiko Ross, David Wheeler, and Julie Ingersoll. This was a really wonderful panel discussion that we had that covered multiple different topics such as Christian Reconstructionism, growing up and participating in Southern Baptist churches for 40 years, experiences in Christian higher education as both a student and a professor, and so much more. It was really, really wonderful to be able to meet these other evangelicals in person and to facilitate a discussion about issues pertinent to our group. It was just extremely edifying and encouraging to meet everyone that was able to come out, and I am super excited that it happened, and I'm very, very enthusiastic about making more of these sorts of events available. And in that spirit, I'm also happy to announce that on October 12th in Chicago here, I will be helping to host a live podcast including the wonderful people from the Unapologetics Tour, which includes Josiah Hessa, Alessandra Goosen, Amanda E.K., and Ryan Connell. Excuse me, Alessandra Ragusen. I apologize if I mispronounced your name, Alessandra. We are going to be having this event at City Lit Books in Chicago at 6:30 p.m. on October 12th. More information will be posted on Facebook and elsewhere. And I really encourage people to come to that event as well. And we're hoping to have another gathering in the evening somewhere in the same neighborhood. More info will be posted online on Facebook and elsewhere. So please keep a lookout for that. It was, again, absolutely thrilling to participate in this event this past weekend, and I will be releasing it as an episode of the show later this month, so be on the lookout for that. As always, you can support the show via Patreon at patreon.com/evangelicalpod. You can follow me on Twitter at brchastain. You can follow the show on Twitter and Instagram at evangelicalpod. And you can now also buy shirts over at evangelicalpodcast.com/shop. All right, everyone, let's get into it. Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Evangelical. My guest this week is Laura Polk. She is an anthropologist currently living in Virginia and is also known for developing the No Shame Movement website over the last few years. Welcome to the show, Laura.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
Likewise. I've followed you on Twitter for a couple of years now, and just you're very, very solid and interesting follow on Twitter, and I'm really happy to learn a little more about you. One of the things that I really just like to start sort of getting to know someone's background. So um, just to get a little bit of understanding of where you're from and everything. Where did you grow up? What was your initial sort of exposure to religion early in life?
Well, I grew up in Virginia, and then in part of my teen years in West Africa as a missionary kid. That's a whole long story in
Mm.
itself, but yeah, mostly Virginia, and I've been part of the church my whole life in some form. Um, I'd say um, the part of my life where that was probably, I guess, the most religious, or the one where I guess I have the best stories from, or most disturbing stories, is I was taken out of public school after fifth grade. Um, this was in the 80s, when sex ed was starting to, well, actually, I guess, be something effective. So that alarmed my parents. They didn't want me taking that, so
Mm.
they promptly put me in a Christian school, um, uh, thus sealing the fact that I would never be the same kind of Christian as them ever again. Um,
Mm.
so I always tell people to think of, if you've seen the movie Saved.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, except I didn't get pregnant and I'm black, and yeah, but other than that, like, Saved is fairly, I'd say, it's fairly accurate. I was sixth through ninth grade in a Southern Baptist school
Mm.
in the early 90s. So it was 89. Yeah, so it was 1990 when I started. It was 89 when I started sixth grade. Um, so 89 through 93. And this was also when the first time we went to Iraq, invaded Iraq,
Hmm.
Operation Desert Storm. So if anyone knows anything about the Southern Baptists, they're super into um, America and the flag and being patriotic. So it was an interesting time to be there.
Mm. Mm.
And yeah, also kind of in the big, kind of during the start of, or I guess in the middle of the whole True Love Waits thing, contemporary Christian music was starting to be a thing where everyone was scrambling to be the Christian version of, like, whatever was popular on the radio. Um, they were trying to counter MTV's message of debauchery.
Right.
And um, yeah, so that was, I'd say, if I look back at, like, the heart of my experience, like in Christianity and around evangelicals,
Mm.
I've been around them most of my life in some form, but I point to those 4 years as probably the ones, um, part of what has shaped me a lot, I guess.
Yeah. And you were there in like a really sort of formative cultural moments. Like
Yeah.
I, uh, you know, like you mentioned, like the Operation Desert Storm and that sort of happening in '91, and then like I don't know, evangelicals are still bent on the Clintons. That's like when they were first ascendant,
Oh,
you know,
goodness.
uh, and how they, the sort of moral panic that it sort of caused amongst evangelicals, and really for some reason still does.
Yeah. It's hard. Like, I taught, I've taught in the past, I've taught undergrad classes, and I'm almost 40 years old, and so I'm realizing I have, well, I have a lot of, I remember things that I'm realizing younger folks don't remember. And, like, those of us who remember Bill Clinton and Monica Lewinsky, and I remember the
Right.
outrage of the evangelicals, um, and watching those same folks kind of, well, Trump had an affair with a porn star and a um, Playboy playmate. Nah,
Yeah.
God
And
uses
he's
everyone.
King David.
God apparently
Yeah.
didn't use Bill Clinton, and God apparently also didn't use Barack Obama, um,
Right.
but apparently God uses Donald Trump. And so it's wild to me to see um, a lot of these folks just kind of shrug this off, especially when I know they were the most adamant,
Right.
staunchly against Bill Clinton, impeach him and run him out of town and all that stuff. So
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And that I'm just a few years younger than you, but I mean, I definitely remember that, and sort of remembering how like upset, like, you know, at least one of my parents was over the whole thing. And, um, uh, yeah, it really is pretty remarkable
yeah,
that, um, that that is just no longer a concern, and it's verified by polls all over the place that evangelicals don't care about the morality of their politicians
well, they're
anymore.
using the example of David because I've been trying to figure out how to write about this at some point, but um,
Hmm.
there was that Washington Post article that just came out. It was the latest one about evangelicals. What are they up to? Like, and it was
Right.
about, I guess they went to some small town in Alabama, and like, because the quote that got shared, because I think I was one of the ones that shared it, was the woman who was saying, "Well, Jesus meant welcome the illegal strangers and only welcome Americans." And
Right.
I was like,
Right.
"Wow, good
Yes.
for her for actually putting it into words," because I definitely been around a lot of folks that thought that, but would never say it out loud. Um, and
Right. And now those people will be emboldened to just say it
yeah.
out
Oh, and
loud.
I also want to bring up too, growing up in Virginia, I grew up near, like in the heyday of like the moral majority. I didn't really know much about the moral majority when I was a kid, but um, and also with in the heyday of the 700 Club and the Christian Broadcasting Network.
Pat Robertson.
I grew up watching that with my
Mhm.
mom. Um, and I remember when Pat Robertson had a little bit more of a sound mind, and um, his network didn't have to apologize for all the things he said. But like that's another thing too. Um, there's folks that grew up in different, I guess, variations or communities of evangelical. But yeah, I definitely grew up around sort of those that older generation of leaders. And Liberty University. I mean, I went to school with folks who ended up going there for college, and my mom also listened to Focus on the
Mhm.
Family all the time. So I also grew up listening to James
Yeah.
Dobson. Fun fact: he used to be for abortion in the cases of assault or if the mother's life is in danger. I will find that quote somewhere, but I do distinctly remember him at one point being for it. In certain cases, but just as an aside. Yeah. So
Yeah.
that
Wow.
also, in terms of like just the cultural moment, like you said, those were also pretty significant too. And Jimmy Swaggart, I also remember
Mhm.
him, and I vaguely remember the Bakers.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't have a memory of the Bakers, but I do remember the E True Hollywood Story. I watched about them once.
I need to watch that. I have not watched that.
That was a good one. So what did you attend like youth group during that time too? Was youth group culture the sort of thing that it was in the late 90s when I sort of arrived in high school and middle school? Um,
Yeah. Yeah, I think they probably by the late 90s maybe had gotten it down more to a science.
uh-huh, yeah.
Um, uh, so I'm like, yeah, this is the anthropologist talking now. um,
Right.
but yeah, I'm trying to think of there's different kinds. Like um, I went to a youth group. I went to events similar to youth group culture at my school. I should also give a little bit of a timeline. I went to like a conservative Mennonite church, and then we actually went to a Black Pentecostal church um, for part of my middle school and teen years as well. Um, and I kind of was in those two or three worlds. So I definitely went
Mm-hmm.
to youth group then too, but they were also doing kind of something similar. They're trying to like rap to the kids, and try to be cool and try to make the gospel fun and Jesus is hip. Um,
Right.
so even though church was definitely very segregated, and the youth groups I was in were very segregated, but there was still that parallel, like that attempt to make Jesus cool. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and so, yeah, Christian rap started to be a thing, um, unfortunately. And although DC Talk, I still listen to them. Their lyrics are abhorrent, but they really actually made really good music, honestly. Um, I have to give
Yeah,
them that. They
everybody's
made
got.
good music.
Yeah.
So I do listen to them still. So yeah, hopefully that answered your question. I've kind of
Yeah,
forgotten.
yeah, it
Yeah.
did. Right. And that's a interesting another sort of interesting element that you mentioned too is that you had all these like varying sort of experiences.
Mhm.
Like you're in the South,
Yes.
you're attending a Southern Baptist school, then you're also attending Black Pentecostal churches,
Mhm.
and before that, a Mennonite church. So like how many sort of different dynamics? I know being an anthropologist now, I'm sure you may have sort of examined your own sort of life retroactively, but even when you were a child, like did you feel the sort of differences between all of those experiences and sort of having to switch between your behavior and everything else amongst all of those different, like
Yeah.
that's a pretty broad array of different like varieties of
Yeah.
Christianity, even in one location.
Um. Yeah. I guess to a certain extent, I'm trying. Like when I was a kid, I didn't think about it as much. I do remember. I didn't really. Because I went to a Mennonite school. Or a Mennonite church. Um. And then the Southern Baptist school. Um, and then actually we were overseas for 2 years when I was in high school. When we came back, I went to a Mennonite high school, and I think that's when I went back to the Mennonites. Like I remember seeing that, really understanding that difference. Because again, like with the Mennonites, they're a peace church, so they believe in pacifism, um, uh, and
Mm-hmm.
they're very staunchly anti-war and all of that. So that contrast is interesting because there were similarities in some of their conservative social beliefs until you got to war and the military, and then Southern Baptists were on one side and Mennonites were on the other, and I think that I kind of noticed.
Right.
As for like the Black church, again, you saw some similarities in some of their beliefs. Definitely the way they approached gender roles and dating and all that stuff. Um, but then, worship style and those kinds of things were different. And also, I think in general, I didn't know there was a word for it until I was an adult. Code switching. A lot of Black folks I know, we especially those of us who grew up in really white settings or were the only one or one of few, um, we kind of learn to code switch early on, even if we don't know that's what we're doing. So,
Mm-hmm.
we learn, like we were one way around on Black folks. Um, so I knew, at the Black church, we knew that someone was gonna get up and yell and carry on or speak in tongues or run around the church, or jump up and down. And I knew at the white churches, at least not the ones I went to, but the ones I went to, we were going to be sitting still. So like, and it was just, yeah. Now I say
Yeah.
that because I do know, especially in the South, there are a few white churches that do kind of carry on and, get the spirit and stuff like that. I've been to maybe one or two.
Right.
So I do know that that is a thing in the South. I don't know anywhere else, but um, there are some that do. But yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's not unheard of. Let's move forward in your story a little bit. You mentioned that you went there from 6th to 9th grade, and this was this really sort of formative period for you. And one of the key reasons was this, like your parents did not want you exposed to sex education. Was that communicated to you as a kid too? Like, this is why you're being pulled out
It
of
was
public
it was
school?
what I overheard folks saying, my parents saying to their friends.
Okay.
I'm a youngest child, and the fun thing about being youngest child is we get really good at eavesdropping and looking like we're not listening. So I was privy to a lot because I could even hear like I could tell the adults were about to say something I wasn't supposed to hear. Um, and so yeah, like it was there are various conversations like that I overheard when they thought I was just quietly playing in the living room. But so yeah, it was just I don't remember them exactly like sitting me down and saying
Right. Yeah.
this. Yeah. They also and I will say this too, they also were kind of concerned about my grades. And I will say this, one of the few positive things, my grades did improve somewhat when I went to a Christian school because I think something to do with smaller class sizes.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think I got a better education by any means. I definitely did not, but my grades did somewhat improve. Um, but yeah, and I also should mention my parents. They were they told me about sex when I was about 8, and my mom just sat me down, basically told me frankly what it was. But they still had really conservative views, and I don't even know what was in the curriculum back then in the late 80s, but apparently it was enough for them to say, well, we don't want her learning that.
Mm,
So
gotcha.
even
Yeah.
though I am grateful that they at least had a talk with me, I still didn't learn very much.
What other sort of aspects? Like Christian education to me is like it's a very fascinating sort of thing to talk about because I feel like the overall population, if they haven't sort of experienced what it is, then it's hard to sort of communicate it without just telling
Mm.
someone. And that's sort of the case whether it's grade school to sort of grade school to grad school, really. Um, like, because it's just there's a different dynamic to education. So what was your school like as far as the way they taught things and the way how was like student behavior sort of controlled and that sort of thing? Because that also plays a big part in Christian education too.
Yeah, it was a really small school. We we didn't have I didn't have any real science classes. I think once I didn't have any real science classes in that I was taught creationist science. So I didn't learn anything about evolution until I was an adult. So I was kind of in that bubble of,
Yeah.
evolutionists, they call them, like it's something people practice or
Right.
something. um, but yeah, it was and also one thing I learned too from Twitter, just from following, I don't remember if you were homeschooled, if you were part of the ex homeschoolers, but a bunch of the folks who were homeschooled, um, we used
Hmm.
some of the same textbooks as they did. Um, so and
Yeah.
like and the homeschooler, like I remember we used to actually play a homeschooling team too when I was in school, and they kicked our asses in softball. I remember. But yeah, but we used books from Bob Jones University and from Pensacola. college.
Right. Yeah.
And those were very much not all of our books, but a lot of them, and those had a Christian theme. Um, so yeah, I guess the way I best remember it is there's a lot of policing and a lot of hand wringing. Um, like there's just lots of policing. We had a dress code. You had to wear girls had to wear skirts to their knees. This was back when that was not in fashion, so shopping was very challenging. Guys couldn't have their hair long. Again, 90s. That was in fashion. Um, they couldn't have any piercings. Uh, so yeah, it was very so that was kind of our like yeah, just a lot of policing. Dancing wasn't allowed. Um, in a school like they didn't really have a prom so much as so anyone who went to a Christian school knows junior senior banquet knows that well.
Right. And
Yeah.
yeah,
And
banquets.
and the Mennonite school I went to
Yeah.
later, even though it's a bit more progressive, we had a banquet. Um and
Right.
yeah, people still
Yeah.
dressed up, but yeah.
Right. You just
Yeah.
had a nice dinner.
Our
Yeah.
oh sorry, go ahead.
My Oh no, I was just going to mention my Christian college had banquets because there was no dancing. So, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's a
And it's
thing.
so like it I don't know. I mean, I got a lot of my dancing out of my system later on, because I actually went to a Christian college, but one that allowed dancing. But I gotta say, I do feel every now and then I feel envious when I see people talk about their proms. Um, 'Cause I didn't have one of those.
Yeah.
But also I wanted to say sports. That was also a big thing in terms of dress code. Basketball team, actually, that was pretty standard because that was when if you I don't know if you remember back in I think it was the 80s, in the early 90s, even in the NBA, I think a lot of the basketball shorts were shorter, and then they just got longer, and then that became the style.
Mhm.
And so yeah, and
Yeah.
so our
Yeah.
basketball team had jerseys and shorts. Our cheerleader, which I was on the cheerleading squad. We had skirts, which is a skirt that's culottes that went down to our knees. That was our uniform, along with a
Mm.
sweater. And also, again, being a cheerleader with no dancing rule was quite interesting. But we actually were not the most extreme. I remember a school that we used to play, another Christian school. Um, Nobody could wear shorts. So the guys, or sleeveless things. So the guys' basketball team had to wear, I'm not making this up, pants, and shirts with sleeves for their basketball uniform.
Did, did they were they breakaway and tearaway pants? Were they or sweatpants?
No, they wore them while they played. Like I guess it was made from the same material
Wow.
that regular basketball jerseys are made from, or basketball uniforms, but they were pants and they had sleeves.
I'm wild.
Yeah, and then the girls had to wear cool. That was weird because the girls had to wear culottes because they couldn't wear pants, so they wore culottes that were below their knees, and the cheerleaders wore skirts that went below their knees because apparently knees are very scandalous. So I remember feeling really bad for them um, and their sports teams.
Yeah, that's pretty legalistic and crazy.
Yep.
So, where where do you sort of go next? And do you at this point when you're still still a kid, still going to middle school, high school, Christian college, you mentioned, um, all this time, how are you sort of feeling about the whole endeavor, like personally? Are you skeptical of it, or do you start to sort of, the popular term now is like start to deconstruct something? When does that sort of happen for you?
Um, well, I feel like I probably was always, if I think about it, was always a little skeptical. I think there was always something in the back of my mind nagging me, um, that was just like, is this really though? Like, are y'all sure? This seems off. Um, but actually, the biggest catalyst was going overseas. We did mission work actually in Ghana, and and that was when I was 15 and 16, and
Mm,
I actually point to that as the biggest catalyst for change. I didn't realize it then, but that's kind of when it started because I was, kind of torn out of my comfort zone, and we went thousands of miles to the other side of the world, and um, around Christians that had, you know, also had staunch beliefs, but were different from the staunch beliefs I was brought up with. Um, and I remember specifically around dating. Now, this is in the 90s. So I think, Ghana has probably changed, a lot like the US has changed since then in terms of its attitudes. But in the 90s, I learned very quickly, oh, dating is not a Christian thing.
mm,
And like, so as a teenager, I'm there and I'm thinking, wait, Christians don't date? Because like up until then, I was taught, well, no, Christians can date, but the right way, like
right.
no touching or anything like that. But you could
Mm,
date. I remember they would give us dating advice during like youth group and stuff. And so, um, you know, you grow up in the evangelical world, they're very certain, right? It's very, no, we're certain this is what the Bible says. But then I went overseas and they were also certain this is what the Bible said. So at some point I was like, somebody is lying. And
mm.
I and that was a start. I was like, how are they both right? Like um just, and there were a lot of other things, just, going through culture shock and um seeing just a different side of the world because I was in a developing country, and I saw both extreme wealth and extreme poverty, um, and saw a lot of really nice, well-meaning white Christians um, who were, well, essentially quite racist in how they treated local folks. Um,
Mm,
so that also kind of shaped um, my understanding of the church, um, especially overseas. And coming back, that's actually why I became an anthropologist. I can also point to that, like being overseas, like um, you know, seeing people trying to do some good in a culture they didn't work hard. They weren't really trying to understand, and weren't really trying to understand what the needs of the people were. So yeah, so that's kind of, I guess, yeah, that was, I guess I could point to that and say that was when I guess, yeah, it was the slow, I planted the seed, and from there I was started changing. I think a lot of it took hold in college, because again, I was in
mhm.
most kind of a progressive-ish school, it's a Mennonite school, and and I was, just surrounded. I was, exposed to different kinds of beliefs, and I think, yeah, and then from there it was just like each experience. From there, um, uh, I became, I started leaving it behind. It wasn't even like I was consciously saying I'm leaving this behind. It was just like after a while, I was like, well, maybe this isn't so bad, or maybe this other thing that I was told I was going to hell for isn't so bad. I I actually moved to Seattle after college, and I lived there for 4 years. Um, and Seattle, is pretty progressive city. has a really strong LGBTQ community. So for a small Virginia, a little Virginia girl, that was really kind of my first
Mhm.
exposure. Like to lots of LGBTQ people. Saw my first Pride parade. Um, I worked at a daycare and saw, there were gay couples there. And throughout that time, I think I kind of was holding on to conservative beliefs, but kind of by a thread. Um,
Yeah.
and I think by the time I came back to the East Coast, and particularly by the time I started grad school, I was just like, actually specifically about people who are LGBTQ, because I definitely was one of those insufferable, like, oh, let's listen to both sides. I was definitely one of those people for a bit, which
Hmm.
is why I don't rant about them enough on social media, and I should, because I remember that feeling of feeling like I was really doing something profound, and now I know that's ridiculous. There's no two sides to someone's existence. But the way I
Right.
ultimately reconciled it was, um, I believed God created us all in God's own image, and it didn't reconcile if someone, like, and I understood just from queer friends sharing their experiences, well, like not choosing to be, certainly, like, being born that way. And I thought, well, if folks are born a specific way and they're made in God's image, why would God create someone um against her own image? Like, that didn't make any sense to me. um and
Right.
that's kind of when I just let that go. It's like, this isn't reconcile
Yeah.
with the God everyone keeps telling me exists. So
Right. Yeah. And I do think I totally sort of resonate with that experience that you mentioned, as far as like it being a
yeah.
process, as far as sometimes it takes time for you to um, be be separate from the beliefs you inherited, and then you examine them versus seeing someone's life and seeing the value in it. Yeah, that I think that's one thing that's sort of that can be lost. Sometimes is that
Hmm.
it's possible to change, and we're also polarized in a lot of ways. That it's it can be easy to forget.
Yeah. Yeah, it's and I don't know. I think, and everyone has their own process, everyone has kind of their own journey. But I think one thing I always want to remember is, be in like, folks can be in their process, but in the meantime, LGBTQ people are just existing out there, and just, they're just existing. So go off in a corner and process, but no, leave them the hell alone. They don't
Right.
need to be. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, I wasn't trying to negate that, especially. That's
Oh yeah, no, I know. No, I know
it's
that. Like, I think, and I wanted to reiterate, because yeah, like, a tiny part of me, I can empathize when folks are kind of
mhm.
struggling, but and I'm a cisgender straight person. Like, I'll sit down and, and try to explain stuff to them. Um, and just, because I have that patience, and also I'm like, I feel like, if I do it, hopefully that frees up someone who's queer who does not have to explain their existence.
Right. Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I think it's like, I'll sit down and talk with them about it, but it's at the end of the day, it's like, yeah, but they don't owe you an education.
Right.
They don't owe you any sympathy, while you grapple with this.
Right. Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
and the same way, I think I see it the same as, like, you know talking with white folks about racism. I'm
Mhm.
always relieved when a white person steps in and explains racism to another white person. Sometimes I don't feel like it.
Right.
And
Yeah.
so it's
Yeah.
kind of the same, yeah.
Yeah. Anytime you are entrusted with privilege, you should use it for someone else's benefit.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm totally I'm in heated agreement with you about that. So, at what point do you start to really tackle these issues? You started a website called the No Shame Movement. Actually, your site actually says it really started as a hashtag on Twitter.
Yeah.
Back about 5 years ago. So within your sort of your process here, from going to all these different life experiences and all these different things, what sort of led you to want to tackle that in particular? On Twitter, talk about processing. Like, Twitter is basically people processing in public nonstop. Like, that's sort
Yeah.
of what it is. So what made you want to do that?
Well, I think it just started from organically finding all these people that were like me.
Mm-hmm.
Because like up until then, I had met people here and there who grew up conservative Christian like myself. Um, but yeah, like then on Twitter, I found like there was all these other folks, and what struck me particularly was a lot of folks who had left religion behind completely. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but still, they were still really affected by all of it, which made sense. I had never really thought of it because I've never really left faith behind. I may not always go to
Mm-hmm.
church or things like, but like, I've kind of kept my faith, and that's my own personal decision. But
Yeah.
it really struck me like, oh wow, yeah, this, even when you leave it behind, which it's understandable a lot of people do, it stays with you. And so just having conversations with other folks that had, went to youth group and listened to god awful Christian music, and um, all that stuff that went along with Christian culture. We started, I think that's around the same time where purity culture began to be a term people used. Um, so there was Lovejoy Feminism, was a blogger that was
Mm-hmm.
talking about it, and then I came across Diana Anderson, um, and who had been blogging about it, and then was in the process of writing her book. Um, and I actually messaged two other people that I had got to know on Twitter and said, "Hey, I feel like I want to have a tag for folks to just talk about their experiences." And so we kind of tossed around a few ideas and came up with that with No Shame Movement. And so it was a tag first,
Mm-hmm.
and I was amazed, like it kind of took off. People start using it, and then someone said, "Hey, you should make a Twitter page." So I made a Twitter page, and then it's like, okay, well, some people may not want to share with their photo, with their Avi sitting there or with their name there. So how can I get
Right.
people to do
Yeah.
it anonymous? How can people do it anonymously? So then Tumblr, someone gave me the idea to do Tumblr, and then finally I registered a domain. And so, yeah, that's where it kind of turned into a website. It's been kind of on and off. Day job often gets in the way um, of the site, but it's really kind of grown organically. Because the biggest reason, and I should back up. The biggest reasons I wanted to do this was the conversation around purity culture was great, but I noticed it was mostly white, cisgender, heterosexual, middle class, college educated women um, talking
mm.
about it with the minivan and a white picket fence and 2.5 kids. And so,
Mm.
like, it was very, very specific. And I was glad, but
Right.
so there was that. And then also there were a lot, I will not name names, but there were some prominent evangelical women bloggers that were still kind of on teetering on that middle, like, oh, purity culture is bad, but you should still wait, because God wants you to. And again, it's like, okay, but what about the
Mm-hmm.
rest of us? I had passed 30, those of us who passed age 30 and realized we may not be getting married anytime soon. And maybe that's just not practical. And that was already the case with quite a few of my friends. Um, but some of us, that's just not sustainable anymore. So that was also why I wanted, like, we did the tag and then the website, because it's like, okay, I want a voice for other folks. And so from there, yeah, like there's like it kind of organically took on all these, I guess, different branches, because we had a lot of folks write in and share their stories. And the biggest, the biggest themes I got from it were gender played a big part. The enforcement of gender roles. Um, a lot of folks who are
Mm-hmm.
married, particularly, you said, I brought all this shame into my marriage, um, because it was real. They were sex was shameful, but then when they got married, they were just supposed to turn that part of their brain off, and a lot of them couldn't, which also was the case for
Right.
a few of my friends offline as well. Um, there I a lo- and then particularly a lot of folks who are LGBTQ, um a lot of their stories, want to, like,
Mm-hmm.
just, compulsory heterosexuality, and the premise of purity culture is that
Right.
um hetero marriages only, um and no other marriages exist, no other relationships exist, like they're completely erased. um,
Right.
then I started hearing
Mm-hmm.
from, like, people about body shaming, and particularly women who are plus size, saying, um, we were kind of just automatically, um, I guess, I don't know what's the word, because that kind of went into the topic of modesty as well. So there's like purity culture is kind of the umbrella, but then there's modesty culture, which kind of went hand in hand, because it's also about body policing and, what clothing is modest. There was a tag called modest, an unfortunate tag called modest is hottest that was going around, um, and I and so there were women who would start writing in and saying, yeah, as a plus size woman, I would never fit into that, because I was considered immodest no matter what. Like if women had like a D cup
Mm.
chest, like it's like it didn't matter what I put on. I just, it was boobs, and I was just immodest no matter what. And so
Right.
yeah, like so all of those things I get just started branching out from there. And it really became about, just elevating voices that weren't usually heard, and particularly, um, I don't know, it's like the rest of us, because purity culture, again, and the standard of purity, wasn't meant for us to begin with. Um, it was, and I actually had read this, I guess it was about 5 or 6 years, maybe 6 or 7 years ago. I read, when I started reading feminist books, and one of the first ones I read was Bell Hooks' Ain't I a Woman, where she breaks down the concept of um, femininity and the fact that Black women weren't ever supposed to be a part of it to begin with. Um, and so, I kept that in mind when I was curating the site, because again, it's like, well, yeah, there's a standard that's really only for a small group of women, meant to put them on a pedestal, and no one
Mm-hmm.
else was really a part of it. LGBTQ people didn't, were erased completely. Women, people who are plus size, didn't fit into it. As a Black woman, I didn't fit into it because we've been hypersexualized pretty much since we were brought here, um, hundreds of years ago. Um, we were never seen as women, we were seen as
Hmm.
objects. So, you know, it, it's one thing to talk against a standard. It's another thing when, well, the standard isn't even for you, so, but you're still supposed to follow it, but it's not for you. So, like, what does that mean? And then also, I think,
Yeah.
branching out and like, because I started reading more, like, I don't want to say the other side, but like, from the pro purity folks and the pro abstinence folks. And I still do. I read, their blogs, and watch some of their YouTube videos. And what strikes me particularly with Black women, is, at the crux of that, I get it. They're fighting against the same stereotype that I am of hypersexuality. Um, and we're only objects, or we're only Jezebels. And the thing is, they take the other extreme. Um, so for them, it's like, we want to be included in this standard, whereas I'm like, "No, I don't want this. Like, the standard is false. Like, it's not real. It was invented, and I don't want to be a part of it at all."
I'm just thinking, even
Yeah,
the people that it's supposedly meant for,
yeah,
it doesn't, you know, it doesn't fit them
right,
because it doesn't fit like human nature. It's you know, it's not an
right.
idealized form of human nature. It's just like you said, it's false, um, and exclusionary in all these different ways that you've said so well. I mean, that's such an incredible and laudable service that you've provided through that, over all these years of making a space for people, because I think that's one thing that people leaving conservative religion sort of
Yeah,
crave, is like just a space to sort of exist in different ways, and sexuality is just a huge part of that.
yeah,
And purity culture has just straight up damaged people. So so yeah, that's, I mean, that's great that you've made it this, this platform for people to reach out to you and ask you questions, even really practical questions, just basic sexual education in some ways, and other ways of addressing, like,
yeah.
just
That's
affirming
like,
like that thing
I'm
that
talking to
someone told you
folks.
is messed up.
I'm saying stuff that I wish someone had told 20-year-old me. Um, you know, and I always see it
Hmm.
as like, I'm just like, I don't know, this sounds sinister, but planting a seed of doubt, or at the very least, just getting them to stop and re-examine, because that's the most important thing. And actually, when I used to teach, I taught
Yeah.
this
Oh,
class
for
of
sure.
sophomores, and we were talking about cultural norms, and we were talking about, well, just, the concept of modesty, and women being topless versus men being topless in public. And it's like, why is one, like, if you see someone on TV, why is one censored and the other isn't? And I remember one woman, raising her hand saying, well, breasts are for reproductive reasons. It's like, okay, well, what about women who don't have kids? And I could see, like, she just kind of paused, like, what? And I left it there because I was like, okay, I don't want to, like, scare the girl, but like that, like, I felt like, okay, I've done my part, because I don't know, is very likely I was the first person that asked that question, not just to her, but many of them in the room. And that was my point. It's like, I just want to ask the question. I want them
Yeah.
to ask themselves, why is it that why was it that Janet Jackson, when her boob was shown for a half of a fraction of a second, there was fallout for years. Um, um, it's actually why we have 5-second delays
Right.
now on, um, live broadcasts. But the very next year on the Super Bowl show, uh, Red Hot Chili Peppers played, and I showed this in my class too. Anthony Kiedis and Flea, lead singer and the guitarist, both took their shirts off. I forgot it, and it was a question I posed, like,
Yep.
why was there no outrage? Why did the network not get fined? And I mean, they were topless for a good part of the show. Um, so it's just important. Like, I just want people to examine what they believe, and understand why they believe it. Um, and it's fun because I've gotten all kinds of I've gotten a lot of support. I've definitely gotten a lot of upset people. um, and not as much lately, but that's also, it hasn't been active lately. But definitely gotten a lot of folks, particularly said I'm trying to shame virgins. I was like, well, virginity isn't a thing. It's invented and it's heteronormative. But or I'm trying to shame abstinence, or I want everyone to be a slut. Um, that's my favorite. I'm encouraging everyone to be a slut or to be promiscuous, because there's no in between. It's either or. And also, and just don't get me wrong, I don't believe in the concept of promiscuity. I think a slut is
Right.
a woman whose decisions about sexuality don't meet other people's approval. And so, but yeah, my favorite one I think was, he was promoting Satan. That was my favorite. The promoting Satan, and destroying values. I was also destroying values. And but yeah, I think it's interesting because, and it makes sense. I think that gets people. Um, I don't know. I think it's an incredibly personal thing. Like, when people, it's funny because when I get backlash, it's like really personal. Like, people are personally hurt, and I get it. It's something you've internalized for so long. Um, and like, this person's coming along and saying there's another option, or like telling you you're wrong in your eyes. Yeah, I can see why. I think even when I was confronted when I was in my early 20s, I think I reacted similarly. Like, what do you mean? What are you talking about? That's ridiculous. Um, so yeah, and like, I get it. It's hard to leave behind these kinds of beliefs. Um,
Yeah, absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah, getting back to that process, I mean, it's really hard to shed something like that just individually. And it's not something that happens all at once.
Yes. And I have to remind myself that too. I have, yeah, like, I definitely have to remind myself, like, everyone's kind of going through that process. Um, but at the same time, and I coming out of it, and a lot of people say, oh, you want everyone to do what you want them to do. It's like, no, I want everyone to understand why they're doing X, Y, and Z. Like, there are people that go through this and come out on the other side and say, you know what, there's some people that have written to me and said, well, I'm still planning to wait till marriage, but I now know it's not mandatory. Like, I don't have to, I just choose to. But there's other people that say, oh, well, I choose to abstain, and for now, and that's okay. Um, the point is that they don't feel like they have to make the decision; they make it for themselves. And that's kind of at the core of, and that's kind of what's at odds with evangelicalism too. Is this notion of
Right.
autonomy? And
Oh
yeah,
yeah, it's completely foreign to evangelicalism. Everything's
it's
prescribed.
scary. It's incredibly scary because, um, and they try to paint it as, oh, you just want to do whatever you want, no consequences. And it's like, well, first of all, I mean, it's funny when I hear that now, because first of all, well, y'all voted a guy in to the White House does that, but sure, okay. But even before, it's like, you just they take it to an extreme, and it's like, you have to do that in order to make it sound sinister. and it's not actually.
Mm-hmm.
Um, like it really isn't. And
Right.
for all of their talk about, um, like you said, like as a prescribed thing, but at the same time, I do remember also at the core of uh, God creating the earth. When I was in Sunday school, God wanted us to have free will, and so again, like, so which is it? We have, like, so what does free will mean then? If it still means we have to follow these arbitrary rules, and then who sets the rules? And again, I go back to, living overseas during my formative years. Um, the biggest thing it helped me understand was there's no right, like, everyone, there's no one person that has all the answers or is living the right way, because when you go overseas and you learn,
Mm-hmm.
like, I went to a country where I learned it was, um it was rude to, like, when I see a friend on the street, it was rude to just wave and keep going. um that was extremely offensive, and I had to learn to stop and talk to people, like, just different things like that. It was just when you learn a completely different way to
Mm-hmm.
live, and after a while that seeps into your faith. It's like, oh, okay, well, if there's more than one way to be polite, then how does this
Yeah.
apply to Christianity, I guess. Um, so
Right.
yeah, it's like, I mean, it's been great. I hope to do more with it. I think the biggest thing with the site is, I really, um I want to see more people. I want to see more sites like it. I'm a big believer in staying in my lane, and so post when I write stuff, or when I give a perspective, I'm giving perspective of a black cis het woman, um, with a graduate degree, who is a size 8. You know, I have, well, I'm visibly able bodied, but I do have a disability. I have attention deficit, but, I don't have mobility issues, all of that stuff. Like, that's my lens. And so, um,
Right. Mm-hmm.
I cannot give the experience of someone who uses a wheelchair and talks about sexuality. But I can find
Right.
other folks who do talk about that,
Yeah.
and elevate them. But I know there's always going to be a million things that I don't see because it's not my lived experience. So what I really, really hope to see is just more
Mm-hmm.
people starting their own sites, um, who have a different lens.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. That I. Yeah. Again, I'm. You're gonna find me in heated agreement with that, because I do think that that's one thing that makes, you know, I don't. Some people have called the internet like a level playing field, and I don't know whether that's true anymore, because people start to gravitate towards particular, like, personalities or different platforms, but it does
Yeah.
allow anyone to publish something. So anytime there's a project, that's worth highlighting, it's always good to do that. I want to pivot a little bit towards, to something else, on a different sort of subject. You mentioned that you're an anthropologist. You've also, you've also got a newsletter that you publish from time to time that's more geared towards, like, evangelicalism and politics, and sort of understanding, why.
Why? Yeah.
Yeah, understanding why. Um, about evangelicals and about the way they think and how important that is for basically the overall population to understand in this historical moment. So, is that part of some of the things that you've looked at, or view from an anthropological lens, or is it a combination of that as well as your lived experience?
Definitely the second. And actually, it's interesting because when I started grad school, and that's right where I really just fully transform into, a secular liberal, or what's the buzz term they call folks who aren't, but yeah, one of those. Um,
I don't know, libs. You're one of the libs that needs to be
yeah,
owned.
yeah.
Owning the libs. That's all I know.
But and the thing about anthropology is it's all about cultural relativism. And I was compelled by my experience of being overseas as a missionary kid. Um, and I was still kind of figuring out how I wanted to approach this. But what was interesting, in my cohort, I was one of two practicing religious people. There's one other woman there who's
Mm-hmm.
Catholic. There is another woman who grew up conservative evangelical, and kind of left religion behind, and everyone else was just kind of either atheist or agnostic, or just kind of spiritual, or what's the other, spiritual, not religious. But I found that, and we would talk, like, my folks in my cohort would ask questions um, about Christian stuff, and I realized I it was almost like being a cultural broker in explaining things, like Jesus Camp. I don't know if you remember that
Mm-hmm.
documentary that came out while I was in grad school,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
and I watched
Mm.
it, and I was like, oh yeah, like um I didn't grow up in that specific world, but I grew up adjacent to it. My mom actually has some beliefs adjacent to some of that, about spiritual warfare and all that stuff. So I was like, oh yeah, like when they had the kids speaking in tongues.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I actually, at the Black Pentecostal Church, I think I was in sixth grade. Maybe I was younger. I remember being in Sunday school and them having us have the kids speak in tongues, like we understood what the hell that meant. Um, but so, like, I remember my
Yeah.
folks in my cohort going, "What the hell? What is happening? What is this? These people are crazy." And it's like, "Oh yeah, no," and I explained it to him. Um, One of my friends came across the site for, I don't know if you remember Battle Cry, that revival. Who's Lou
No, I don't think
somebody.
so.
I don't know if they do it anymore, but it's one of those, like, Christian revival, um, I guess, things that they have, but it's like geared for young people. Um, and there's a lot of lights and music and all that. And like my friends looking at me like, "Oh my God, Laura, what is this? What is this battle cry? What's this about swords?" And so I had to explain to her, "Oh no, no, it's okay. They're not actually going to war. That's actually from the Bible. Like the swords was the fruits of the spirit, like the sword of the, yeah, helmet of salvation. And all
Mm.
that. Yeah." And I was like, "Yeah, it's a metaphor."
Oh yeah. Yep. Put on the. Yeah, I worked at a Christian bookstore when Bible Man was a thing. So
Bible what?
Bible Man, he was a
Oh, Bible Man. I kind of vaguely remember Bible Man.
he was like purple and yellow and like
Oh goodness. I
it was ridiculous. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, I was just
It's
thinking, yeah, I need to go back and watch, because I wonder if that was a little bit beyond, but after my generation. Because my generation was salty, and the singing psalm book was creepy as hell, and
yeah.
the
Yeah, my wife watched a lot of
yeah,
Salty. I
Salty was creepy. And Adventures
we
in
were
Odyssey. Um,
Oh yeah, that one had a lot of play at my
Yeah.
Sunday school.
But yeah, but I just realized, like, oh, I kind of know a lot about this, and slowly, like, American Christianity specifically became kind of my focus in my research, and I realized, oh, like, I'm interested in this. I'm looking at this from as a former insider, um, and this is really important. I actually got to be a part of a research project. I started in grad school and continued a little after. We were looking at faith-based organizations, and I was assigned to research two evangelical organizations, one of which was a crisis pregnancy center. Um, and if you've heard any of the news around those, crisis pregnancy centers are basically, like, they're basically trying to dissuade women, not just, they're trying to dissuade them from having abortions, but also just, they're also trying to convert them, trying to, make them
Right.
live a specific way, indoctrinate them a specific way. And so, and it was interesting because I was studying this, and I was originally studying just one site, a community center, and then I had to take over the CPC project from someone else who, I think, got a fellowship somewhere, and she grew up agnostic, and she, like, we were talking, it was clear, she's like, oh wow, you, like, I knew more about, like, there are certain things we were reading about, I'm like, oh yeah, I know what that means. And so she was like, "Oh wow, yeah, I'm glad I'm passing this to you because you seem to understand this." And I think I was a little bit less disturbed by things than she was, which again, I guess I try to. It's good too, also, to hear different people's perspective, because I mean, these things are normalized when you're growing up. I think that's the biggest thing I've learned just from getting to know folks on
Yeah.
Twitter and from talking about this. Just so many things you normalize, and you're around other people are like, oh, so you didn't have to speak in tongues in your Sunday school? Oh, um, like, like, the just, yeah, so many things that you just don't think about, and then you're like, oh, you didn't grow up scared that the rapture was gonna come and, like, everyone's gonna disappear? Like, no, okay, just me. So yeah, I think that was the kind of the biggest thing, and I actually have thought about going back to grad school for a PhD studying American Christianity. Um, I've talked myself out of it, thankfully, but I have been looking at lately, kind of how to use that expertise, because there are a lot of academics studying it. There are fewer that grew up in a religious background. There's even fewer that are like me, who grew up in a specific, conservative background. And so it's almost kind of, I don't want to say we're unicorns, but I feel like, there's perspective we can have, and I mean, it's similar to, like, what a lot of the evangelicals on Twitter, what you
Oh
all have been
yeah.
saying, and I know a lot have been, like, pushing back with the media as well, and writing about evangelicals, saying, yeah, whoever wrote this article doesn't know anything about them, and you should get one of us, yeah. So
Right.
I just, like, I
Yeah.
think, oh, so for
Yeah.
example, was that there was a photo last year of the president, hate calling him that, but a 45 in the Oval Office, and the guys laying hands on him, the pastors. And I remember, like, there was a few times I'd explain that to folks, like, what that meant, because they're like, why are the hands on him? And but, like, just things like that. And also, I think and particularly as a Black evangelical too. And there's a few of us, like I also, there's been a lot of them talking about race and the racism of the Christian right, and there's been a lot of there's been white evangelicals talking about, yes, no, we're not surprised that all these people voted for Trump and his racism. You know, when like, really, just there's only a certain sector of people who are shocked. And going further, like, I really want to talk more about kind of what that means, and like, you know, the various dog whistles that continue to come out when we look at Trump. I mean, just blatantly, Obama was a member
Right.
of a church. He was
Yeah.
a member. I've been to that church actually, a long time ago, before he was Obama, like before he really was well known. But I've been to, like, he was a member of a church. Everyone remembers that because his pastor got him into some trouble by saying some controversial things. He sang a gospel
Mm-hmm.
song, you know, like, he quoted scripture all the time. He talked about his own
Yeah.
faith all the time. Um, and the people that are just fixing their mouths to say, "Oh, well, in Trump we have a real Christian," and Trump he can't correctly name a book of the Bible. He's not I mean, and there's nothing. I mean, like, and it's not a. I'm not saying that it's a requirement to be Christian to be present. I'm saying it's it's almost laughable the way they're really trying to paint. No, Obama wasn't Christian, but Trump. No, like, like, he
Oh
can't
yeah.
name a book of the Bible. Um, he Yeah, I mean, there's just a laundry list of
Right.
things. Um, like, if you yeah, like, and it's amazing to me. Like, it's truly amazing to me, like, to watch people bend over backwards with the dog whistles, um, and not make it about, we didn't want a Black president. We didn't Yeah, we didn't want him there, and now we have a guy that espouses our racist beliefs, but we're trying to twist it and say, oh no, because he's Christian. No, um, everyone a lot of us see through it, and um, I've been trying to figure out ways to, like, kind of articulate that more, um, and yeah, and just, I mean, they're just kind of telling on themselves every day with the situation with the border,
Mm-hmm.
where you're seeing people shrug and say, well, um, the kids, they're fine. They're in, it's almost like they're in camp. Like, like, they're just, like, they're making excuses, um, for really, deplorable. Sorry to use that word, but deplorable actions.
Right. It's an apt word.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's appropriate.
And I actually today, for funsies, I was reading. I don't know if you remember, the folks on the family. Um, they wrote this. There's this letter that came out. It was the month before the 2008 election, when I think evangelicals had an oh shit moment, like Obama might win and some of ours might help him get elected. And so
Mm-hmm.
someone wrote a letter, supposedly from the future, to Christians, saying, this is what happens if you elect Obama. Um,
Oh god.
so, because I haven't stopped thinking about that letter since then. Like,
Right.
like, once every other month, I'm like, yeah, they wrote that happen. But yeah, so I've been thinking about, like, writing something about that, but it's really fascinating. And again, like, with the dog whistles and stuff like that. But
Mm-hmm.
yeah, basically, I mean, they keep using words like liberal and stuff like that, but I mean, it's basically, liberalism, and children cry, and the streets are filled with blood, and all that kind of stuff. They were really, like, they were really terrified, of this. I think the way I would describe a lot of, especially older conservative Christians, they've created kind of this utopian white world, um, that never really existed, but does in their mind. Um,
Yeah.
they've created this utopian world, and now it's falling apart. Um, you can't get away from brown people anymore. You used to be able to. That's why we had suburbs and white flight. Suburbs were created because they were trying to get away from black people. But now, refugee resettlement, you got, in immigration, you have brown folks in rural parts of Nebraska. Um, you
Hmm.
can't get away from it. So you can't ignore sexual orientation anymore. Um, Churches I was a part of, um, like either talked about it as a sin or just ignored it completely, like it didn't exist, and you can't anymore. Um, and so,
Right.
yeah, like they're really really scared that the world is changing, that they don't recognize it. Um, and so, yeah, I mean, I totally understand why they would embrace someone like Trump. Um, I think deep down they know it's temporary. I think ultimately they know they're losing the culture wars or whatever. But um, yeah, I think that's I think that's kind of the at the heart of a lot of this. It's this um, same as back in the '60s when there were white citizens councils. Um, that were formed to keep black people out of neighborhoods. And it was the same mentality, like, oh no, like our world is changing and we need to cling to these beliefs. So
Hmm.
yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad that I'm glad that you're you're engaging with these things and doing things that are letting people understand the value of your experience and your expertise in these areas,
Yeah.
because it is absolutely essential to understand the dynamics of this and how it affects the marginalized communities in our country. And just throughout the
Yeah.
world, because evangelicalism has ripple effects. Uh, yeah. So yeah, I'm very very glad that you're investing in this sort of stuff, because the world needs it to be very very honest.
It does. And and also, like, and again, like, and that's why I'm glad I'm really, I feel grateful now, depending on the day. There's some every now and then I'm kind of like, oh, I wish I had a normal childhood, whatever that means.
Yeah.
um but like, I am grateful often that I had those experiences, because for one thing, I know how to argue. Taught me how to argue with different people. Uh Taught me to, like, see things from different perspectives. And I think particularly, again, the particularly with the black church tradition, um I think what kind of fascinates me about sort of the other side of that is, Christianity, like, when my ancestors were enslaved, Christianity was forced upon them. And, like, there was this notion of, the African, quote, savages they were bringing, and, helping them become Christians and saving their souls. And it amazes me, and fills me with a sense of pride, because, my ancestors took it around and used it against them. And
Hmm.
they couldn't, like, enslaved people couldn't gather together in groups, because they could get ideas. So they had church services. So on the surface, it's like, oh, they're having church service, but, like, yeah, we are, but we're also plotting. Um, they used spirituals that on the surface sounded just regular gospel songs, but also were basically talking about running away. Um, like, we took something, placed upon us, and used it, um, as a tool liberation. And yeah,
Hmm.
and we've been doing that, like, and that was, you know, through the civil rights movement. Like, the church was still kind of a central place where, um, where people gathered, and and organized. And even now, churches that are involved in Black Lives Matter, and they're at the center of this. Um,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, like I think that's interesting because, on the one hand, there's the white, conservative movement that was, opposed, but then I also got to see the tradition where, that was used as part of liberation. So I feel grateful that I, um, can understand both of those, um, yeah, and how they played out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, Laura, thank you so much for talking about all of this with me. Where can people find you, just online or elsewhere, to find more of your work or follow you online, wherever you might want to point people?
Sure. Let's see. I can follow me on Twitter, see Lola Go. Um, and then my website is noshamemovement.com. And No Shame Move, No Shame, and then MOV, Twitter handle. I am actually in the process of putting together, some workshops and speaking engagements, around the stuff we talked about evangelicalism, about purity culture, and about intersection of race. So if folks are interested in having me speak to their group or lead them in a workshop, I would say, yeah, just at me on Twitter or email me at noshamemove@gmail.com. And there's I can put the link up. I think there's a link on my Twitter page. So yeah,
Awesome. Awesome. Laura, thank you so much for joining me today.
thank you for having me. It was fun.